The girl was 7 years old, and the sentence she said out loud in the middle of the Aurelia Grand's lobby was not the kind of sentence a 7-year-old should already know how to say without her voice shaking. They didn't pay my mom. Now she's too sick to ask again, and I don't know who else to tell. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. She said it the way children say things they've already rehearsed silently 100 times over, until the sharp edges wear down into something almost calm. There was no crying in it. There was no performance in it. It was simply the truth she had been carrying since dinner, set down in a room full of strangers, because a room full of strangers was, somehow, easier to say it to than one more empty hallway back home. No one answered her. A night clerk glanced up, clocked a small girl alone at 20 to midnight, and looked back down at his screen, because looking back down was easier than deciding what to do about her. A guest hurried past dragging a suitcase, eyes already fixed on the elevator, rainwater darkening the shoulders of his coat in 2 wide patches. A doorman kept his gaze fixed on the rain-blurred entrance, the way doormen are trained to do when something inconvenient sits 6 feet to their left and has no obvious solution attached to it. In most cities, this is exactly where the story would end. A child speaks. No one listens. Morning comes anyway, indifferent to what happened in the hours before it. Except a man had just stepped through the revolving door, shaking rain from a coat that had gone dark at both shoulders, and he did not function like the rest of the lobby. He never had. His name was Julian Castellane, 39 years old. He owned this hotel, and 11 more scattered along the coast, and a shipping and ports company that moved freight in and out of a harbor most people in this city could see from their kitchen windows, but had never actually walked the length of. He had given exactly 2 interviews in 14 years of running the company and had approved no photographs from either of them. There were board members who had worked alongside him for a decade and could not, if pressed, describe with any confidence what made him laugh. He had one rule that had nothing to do with any of that and everything to do with why this particular story exists at all. He did not walk past a child sitting alone at night. Not once, not ever, regardless of what waited for him upstairs, regardless of whose signature he needed by morning. That rule had a name attached to it, the name of a woman who had once waited far too long, on a cold office floor, for someone to notice she wasn't getting up. She had survived. But the rule had been built in the 40 minutes it took anyone to find her, and it had never once, in nearly 30 years, been allowed to bend. That is why, at 9 seconds past 11:40, Julian Castellane stopped walking toward the elevator and turned his head instead toward a wooden bench under the atrium skylight. Somewhere on the operations floor of that same building, a man named Desmond Ashcombe was 2 floors above the lobby, working late over figures that would not, if anyone thought to check them carefully, add up the way his monthly reports insisted they did. He did not yet know that his career had roughly 6 hours left to run. Somewhere across the harbor, in an office lined with sailing trophies she had won decades earlier and never stopped polishing, a woman named Adrienne Solvig was finishing the last of a bottle of wine and reviewing a shipping manifest with the particular satisfaction of someone who believes her plans are still entirely her own. And 2 floors above the lobby, in room 1408, a housekeeper named Margot Calder was on her knees beside an unfinished bed, running a fever she had been ignoring for 6 days, about to become, without asking for it, without wanting it, without any warning at all, the reason every one of those careful plans came apart at once. If you want to see how the smallest, quietest person in this entire building quietly rearranged the fate of everyone more powerful than her inside it, stay through to the end. New original stories like this one arrive every week, and subscribing means you never have to go looking for the next one. Now, back to the lobby, where the rain was still falling. It had been falling over the harbor since a little before 6 that evening, and by 20 to midnight it had settled into the particular, patient rhythm that suggested it had no intention of stopping before sunrise. Inside the Aurelia Grand, none of that weather was permitted to exist in any way that mattered. Chandeliers threw soft gold light across marble that had been polished within the hour. The walls were paneled in dark cedar that swallowed sound the way heavy curtains swallow daylight, and there was music, if you actually listened for it, woven so quietly through hidden speakers that most guests never consciously registered it was playing at all. It was the kind of manufactured calm five-star hotels build on purpose, at real expense, because silence like that is a product just as much as the rooms upstairs are. Julian crossed that manufactured quiet without disturbing a single note of it. His coat was still dark at both shoulders where the rain had reached him in the short distance between the car and the awning. He didn't shake it off. He simply came to a stop near the inner edge of the revolving door with the particular stillness of a man who had already read every face in the room before anyone realized he had entered it at all. His eyes found the bench under the skylight before the rest of him had consciously decided to look for it, a habit built over years of walking into rooms where the wrong kind of inattention could cost him money, leverage, or worse. A girl. 7, maybe 8. No adult within 4 meters of her. No phone visible. No folded coat set carefully aside the way a parent leaves one when they mean to be back in a minute. And she had clearly been there a long while, long enough that her legs had stopped swinging beneath the bench, long enough that her shoulders had settled into the exact, resigned angle of a child who has quietly stopped expecting the waiting to end soon. She was holding a small tin box against her chest with both arms, the careful, protective grip some children use for stuffed animals and others use for something they were told, very seriously, never to lose. Julian crossed the marble toward her at an unhurried pace, approaching from the side rather than straight on, the way you approach something that has stopped running from you, but hasn't yet decided whether it can trust you not to run at. He lowered himself into a slow crouch 3 feet from the bench, keeping his face level with hers rather than looming over her, his hands open and visible on his knees the entire way down. "You said someone didn't pay your mother," he said quietly. "Can you tell me what happened from the beginning? Take your time." She studied him first, the way she seemed to study everything, the wet coat, the tired lines around his eyes, the fact that he had waited to be let closer instead of simply walking up and crouching down without asking. Something in the careful studying seemed to settle her, at least a little. "She cleans rooms here. For years." Her voice was steady, precise, the voice of someone reciting facts she had already checked and double-checked inside her own head, more than once, to make sure she'd get them right if anyone finally asked. They didn't pay her for 6 weeks. She got sick and missed some shifts because of it, and the man who runs her floor told her that people who can't be relied on can't expect to be paid like people who can. She told me that part on the way home. She didn't want to, but I asked twice. Julian did not let his face move. But something behind his eyes had already begun quietly rearranging itself around what she'd just said. "Her name's Margot," the girl continued. "I'm Ines. She's upstairs finishing a turn down on 14. She said she'd only be a minute and then we'd go home together." She glanced, briefly, toward the elevators, then back at him. "It's been 40 minutes. I counted on the lobby clock. 40 minutes. Julian had heard that exact stretch of time before, a very long time ago, and it had cost him more than he had ever once told another living person, including the men who had worked at his side for over a decade. He did not call the front desk. He called one man directly, the head of his own security, whose number he knew by memory the way some people know their own, and gave him a single instruction with no explanation attached to it at all. "Find her now, room 1408. Go immediately." While he waited, something rose up behind his eyes that had nothing to do with tonight, Not directly, though it explained tonight completely. A hospital corridor rebuilding itself out of nothing at all, pale beige walls, a row of bolted plastic chairs, the particular chemical smell of antiseptic that almost, but not quite, matched the smell of the marble beneath his own boots right now. 30 years and one lifetime later. A boy of 10 on one of those chairs, a school bag balanced on his lap, watching the long hand of a wall clock complete its second full slow revolution because the woman he was waiting for was somewhere on the far side of a door he wasn't allowed through, and no one, not one single adult moving past him in either direction, had thought to ask why a child was sitting there alone at that hour, or whether he'd eaten anything since breakfast. His mother had scrubbed floors, too, though not in a hotel, in an office tower on the far side of the harbor, the overnight shift nobody envied and nobody watched, cleaning up after a workday that had already ended for everyone except her. She had been paid late so many times across so many years that late had simply become the weather, an inconvenience you dressed for rather than an event you complained about. She used to say things would get better, usually while sitting at their small kitchen table peeling dried cleaning solvent off the backs of her own hands with a thumbnail, flakes of skin lifting away with the chemical the cheap gloves were never quite thick enough to keep out. One winter, when Julian was 10 years old, she collapsed on that office floor at 2 in the morning during her rounds, and it took the building's overnight security staff nearly 40 minutes to find her, because 2 men on duty that same night had each, independently and without ever discussing it aloud, quietly assumed she was someone else's responsibility to check on. She survived. The margin, the doctors told him years later when he was finally old enough to ask directly, had not been generous. But Julian never once forgot those 40 minutes, and somewhere inside that specific memory, on that specific night, a rule was born that had absolutely nothing to do with boardrooms, contracts, or anything resembling business. A rule built entirely from the private, unspoken promise of a boy on a plastic chair who had told himself, without any adult ever instructing him to, that he would never again let a number like that one pass by unremarked and unmoved. The flashback lasted perhaps 3 seconds in real time, no more. When his attention came fully back to the lobby, Ines was still watching him with the same steady, patient attention. She had noticed the pause, the small stillness that had come over his face and then passed. She said nothing about it, and something in her deliberate restraint told him, with unexpected clarity, that she already understood, at 7 years old, exactly how much certain silences were worth respecting rather than filling. His head of security, Teo Bramonti, 11 years with the company, hands that had learned patience carving small wooden animals for shelter children every Sunday for 6 years running, arrived at a controlled jog carrying a folded charcoal blanket taken from the fireplace cabinet without asking anyone's permission first. He held it up for Ines to see clearly before he came any closer, the way you show someone what you're offering before you offer it. "It's cold by this window," he said, his usual flat working voice softened by a full quarter step. "May I?" She gave one small, careful, deliberate nod, the nod Julian would learn over the following weeks of a child who evaluated every single request before granting it, regardless of who is asking. Teo draped the blanket over her shoulders without any unnecessary contact and stepped back immediately afterward, and in 11 years of working beside this man, Julian had never once heard that particular gentleness surface in his voice before tonight. "Thank you," Ines said quietly. "You're welcome, little miss." Teo turned toward the elevators without waiting for a reply, and as he passed, Julian spoke without raising his voice above the lobby's hidden music at all. 14th floor. Margot Calder. Find her, whatever it takes, and call me the moment you do. Room 1408's door had been propped open with a small black wedge, the kind housekeeping carried in every apron pocket for exactly this purpose. Teo stopped outside it for half a second and listened before stepping through. Nothing at first. Then, very faintly, the scrape of a breath being held longer than it should be and then released too fast. He stepped in. The housekeeping cart stood at a slight angle a few feet from the door, as though whoever had been pushing it had frozen mid-motion and simply never returned to finish the thought. A clean sheet lay folded neatly over the cart's handle, prepared and abandoned in the same instant. On the floor beside the half-stripped bed, her back against the frame, was Margot Calder, conscious, her name embroidered in careful cursive above the left breast pocket of her uniform, exactly where her daughter had said it would be. Dark hair stuck flat to her forehead with sweat, the flush along her cheekbones the particular dusky color of exhaustion that has been ignored for weeks longer than any body should be asked to tolerate it. She was no older than 32, and the first words out of her mouth were not "Who are you?" and were not "What's happening to me?" They arrived instead as a torn, urgent whisper that barely cleared the quiet of the room. "Ines. Where's Ines? Is she still downstairs? Is she alone, please?" "Downstairs. Safe. Someone's sitting with her right now, and she has a blanket, and she is not alone for one more second." Teo kept his voice low, level, the same voice he used on frightened animals and frightened people both, having learned over the years that the two were more alike than most people wanted to admit. "I need you to breathe for me before we do anything else." Margot closed her eyes for a long moment, one hand pressed flat against the carpet beside her hip, the particular bracing posture of a person readying herself to receive bad news she already half suspects is coming for her. Julian arrived at the open door without a single sound, took the whole room in with one unhurried glance, and crossed the carpet to kneel beside her, angling his own face below the level of hers. The exact same instinct that had put him at eye level with her daughter downstairs a few minutes earlier, though he hadn't consciously decided to repeat the gesture. "Miss Calder, I have a car waiting downstairs and a doctor already on his way to meet us. May I help you stand? I can manage on my own." She tried, pushing up hard against the bed frame, and her arm buckled at the elbow before she'd risen 6 inches. "You can't, and that's all right. It isn't a failure, it's a fever." He slid his arm carefully beneath hers and brought her up onto her feet against his side in one smooth, unhurried motion. She weighed almost nothing. Through the thin cotton of her uniform, he could feel the wrong kind of heat radiating off her skin, the particular heat a body produces when it has been running for far too long on nothing but caffeine and skipped meals and sheer stubborn refusal to stop. The clinic Teo drove them to sat behind an unmarked door on the ground floor of a converted brick townhouse 3 streets back from the water. Dr. Amara Ewan had treated Castellane employees quietly, by referral only, for 11 years, and had built a private, well-earned reputation for asking every question medicine required of her, and not one question beyond it. Her verdict came 40 careful minutes later, delivered in a low, unhurried voice out in the hallway where Margot couldn't overhear the exact clinical weight of it. Exhaustion, compounded by weeks of malnutrition. A sprained wrist that's gone untreated for close to 3 weeks because she genuinely believed she couldn't afford a doctor's visit on top of everything else. A low-grade infection her body's been quietly fighting on almost nothing at all. Dr. Ewan paused, choosing her next words carefully. "She'll make a full recovery, Mr. Castellane, provided she actually rests, eats properly, and stops apologizing to me for needing basic help in the first place. But I want to say this plainly because I think someone should. Whatever has been happening inside that hotel of yours very nearly cost you an employee tonight. And it has already cost her 6 full weeks of pay she was never once given." Julian said nothing in response. He was already doing arithmetic of an entirely different kind, the sort that does not stop conveniently at 6 weeks, and does not stop, either, at the name of a single missing paycheck. It was past 2 in the morning when Teo returned to Julian's study with the first hard numbers, his voice pitched carefully flat in the particular way of a man delivering news he already knows will land badly. "It isn't only her, sir. Wages have been coming up short across housekeeping, laundry, and kitchen staff for months now. I've found 23 separate names so far, and I don't think I've found all of them yet. The money routes through a vendor account that doesn't correspond to any actual maintenance work anywhere in this building. And every single transfer traces back to the same authorization code." Julian waited, already knowing, in some quiet, dreading part of himself, what came next. "It's Desmond's," Teo said. The name settled into the study the way something genuinely heavy settles onto a table, not dropped, exactly, but lowered, deliberately, by someone who understood precisely what its weight would do once it landed. 17 years. Desmond Ashcombe had stood at the operational center of this entire company for 17 years, trusted with more quiet authority than almost anyone else on the payroll, precisely because no one, least of all Julian himself, had ever once thought there was a reason to look at him twice. Julian looked once toward the closed door of the clinic's recovery room, where, through the narrow gap beneath it, he could just make out a 7-year-old girl asleep in a chair with both small hands still wrapped tightly around her mother's. "Get me everything you can find by morning," he said quietly. "And call every senior member of staff in for 9 o'clock. All of them. No exceptions and no explanation given in advance." Teo did not sleep that night, and he had no intention of trying. He worked from his own flat instead of the company network, because the one lesson 11 years in this particular line of work had drilled into him was that a search leaves footprints, and footprints get noticed, sooner or later, by exactly the people you least want noticing them. He started with the vendor account itself, Kestrel Maintenance Supply, a name that appeared, month after unremarkable month, buried inside the hotel's operations ledger. Always for amounts sitting just beneath the threshold that would have triggered a second signature and a second set of eyes. No maintenance log anywhere in the building referenced a single work order tied to it. No invoice matched a technician's name, a delivery slip, a call-out time, a part replaced. As far as Teo could determine after 4 straight hours of careful cross-referencing, the company existed on paper and nowhere else at all. A name, an account number, and nothing underneath either one. He called in a favor from a former colleague, a woman now auditing accounts at a downtown accounting firm who owed him for a favor of her own from years back, and had never once asked what it had actually been for. By sunrise, she had traced Kestrel's account back through 2 shell layers to a numbered holding company registered 11 months earlier. 1 month, Teo noted with a small, cold tightening in his chest. Before Margot Calder's very first missed paycheck had gone quietly unremarked by anyone at all. 23 names came out of the full payroll cross-check by the time he finished. Housekeeping, laundry, kitchen staff. Shortfalls ranging from 2 missed weeks all the way up to 5 full months. Every one of them belonged to someone who, on their own, would never have carried the standing inside this company to complain loudly enough to actually be heard over it. Every single transfer moved through the same 4-letter operations code, the one Desmond Ashcombe had used, without incident or question, to authorize hotel expenditures for the better part of 2 decades. There was more, and it was worse. A second, smaller thread led Teo to a private account receiving irregular deposits that matched no bonus structure, no consulting arrangement, no legitimate line item he could find any honest name for it all. Whoever had built this had built it carefully enough that it had taken, in the end, a genuine coincidence to finally shake it loose. A 7-year-old on a bench at midnight, and her mother collapsed 2 floors above her. Teo laid the entire folder across Julian's desk at 6 that morning, thin enough to carry in one hand, heavy enough to end a career with it. 23 people, sir. Some of them for months at a time. All of it moving through an account that has never once done a single hour of real work in this building. Julian read it through twice, standing, his coat still folded over the back of the chair from the night before, untouched since he'd first sat down with it. He did not raise his voice, because in 14 years of running this company through every kind of difficult conversation imaginable, he had genuinely never once needed to. Call every senior member of staff in for 9, he said. And find out exactly where Desmond is right now, this minute. Already checked, sir. He's at his desk. Early, same as always. Julian looked up at that, something briefly unreadable crossing his face. Same as always, he repeated quietly, almost to himself, and did not explain what the phrase had cost him to say out loud. By 9 that morning, the long conference room on the top floor of the Aurelia Grand held every department head and senior manager across the entire Castellane group, 31 people standing in loose, uneasy rows along the walls, because no one had thought to sit first, and no one wanted to be the one who did. The message that had gone out at 7 had said only, 9 o'clock, mandatory, no exceptions given. Julian Castellane had not called a full assembly of senior staff in 6 years. The summons itself had already become the news, whispered floor to floor before anyone in that room had the faintest idea what it was actually about. Desmond Ashcombe arrived 4 minutes early, exactly as he always did. Gray suit, the one he wore, by long habit, on days he considered important, which was also exactly as he always did. 52 years old, silver threading through at both temples, a face built carefully over 17 years of practice to look reassuring in precisely this kind of room. He greeted 3 people by name on his way toward his usual seat near the head of the table, and each of them answered him warmly, because he was good with names, and had always been good with names, and 17 years of quiet. Dependable service teaches a man exactly which small kindnesses buy the deepest trust for the least visible cost. Julian let the room sit in complete silence for a long moment before he spoke at all, long enough that the silence itself became its own kind of pressure, settling over 31 people who had gathered expecting bad news about the Harbor Bridge contract, or a merger, or layoffs, and had not yet begun to suspect it might instead be about one of their own. Desmond, he said finally. Come up here, please. The reaction arrived in 2 distinct layers, and Julian watched both of them happen in real time, one after the other, without moving a muscle of his own face. The first was exactly what a trusted, 17-year operations chief was supposed to display when singled out in front of the entire senior staff: mild, appropriate surprise, a slight questioning tilt of the head, the willing, unhurried step forward of a man with absolutely nothing to hide. That first layer arrived precisely on schedule, the way a well-rehearsed line arrives on cue. The second layer came a full quarter-second earlier than the first, and vanished just as quickly, folded back beneath the surface before most people in that room would have registered it existed at all. It was not surprise. It was recognition, sharp, immediate, entirely involuntary, the flinch of a man who has spent months quietly bracing to hear his own name spoken in exactly that tone, and has just, finally, heard it. Julian gave no outward sign that he had seen either layer pass across Desmond's face. He simply opened the folder in front of him and turned it around to face the room. 23 employees, he said, his voice never once climbing above its usual, unhurried register. Housekeeping, laundry, kitchen staff. Wages withheld anywhere from 2 weeks up to 5 full months at a stretch. Every transfer routes through a vendor account that has performed exactly 0 hours of verifiable work inside this building. He set the top page down flat on the table, unhurried, The way a man lays a single card down when he already knows precisely what's underneath the rest of the deck. And every one of those transfers carries the same authorization code. He let the silence hold for a beat longer than it needed to. Yours, Desmond. No one in that room moved. 31 people seemed, for one long second, to stop breathing at almost exactly the same moment. One of those 23 employees, Julian continued, quieter now, is a woman who was found unconscious on the 14th floor of this hotel last night, running a fever she had been hiding for 6 days because she genuinely could not afford to miss another shift on top of the ones she'd already lost pay for. Her 7-year-old daughter spent 40 minutes alone on a bench in our own lobby waiting for her, because there was nowhere else in this entire building for a child to safely wait. He paused, letting that land fully before he finished. In a building that carries my own name on the deed above the door. Desmond's mouth opened. What came out of it, at first, had the general shape of an explanation, a vendor dispute, an accounting irregularity that had simply gotten away from him. Something he could clear up given a little time and the benefit of the doubt he'd earned over 17 years. Then it simply stopped mid-sentence, because Julian had done nothing more than look at him directly, and under that look the sentence itself seemed to lose whatever will it had left to finish being spoken. What followed came out of Desmond in fragmented pieces, standing in front of 31 colleagues who had trusted him, without a second thought, with keys, with codes, with the daily operational heartbeat of the entire company for the better part of 2 decades. Pressure, he said. A debt that had grown far larger than he'd ever intended it to. A genuine intention, he insisted more than once, his voice cracking slightly on the second repetition, to pay every last cent of it back quietly before anyone was ever forced to notice. Julian let him finish completely before he answered. Every stolen wage is returned within 48 hours. Doubled, with a written personal apology from me, attached to each one, because this happened under my name, and that makes it my failure exactly as much as it is yours. He came around the table slowly and stopped directly in front of Desmond. Margot Calder receives full back pay, every medical expense fully covered, and a permanent position waiting for her the moment she's cleared to return to work. You will sign every one of those transfers yourself today before you leave this building. Yes. Yes, of course, Julia. You're removed from operations, effective immediately. You'll work under Teo's direct supervision reviewing warehouse inventory, the same entry-level position you started in 17 years ago, before any of this. Julian's voice never once lifted through any part of it, not even slightly. 17 years of service bought you your job back today, Desmond. It did not buy back my trust, and I want to be honest with you in front of this room rather than quietly later. Nothing you have left to offer me is worth that much anymore. He turned and walked back toward the head of the table without waiting for a response. Everyone else, back to work. Thank you for coming in early. The room emptied inside a single minute, 31 people filing out in a silence that felt, to more than one of them, heavier than anything that had actually been said aloud. Desmond stood alone on the carpet for a long moment afterward, straightening his suit jacket with both hands in slow, mechanical movements, and if anyone had lingered behind to watch his face closely in that particular instant, they would have seen the second layer surface again, not gratitude this time, not even close to it, but something colder, more deliberate, the unmistakable look of a man already quietly calculating what remained of a life he had believed, until 9 o'clock that morning, was still entirely his own to manage. To understand why Desmond Ashcombe took 23 months' worth of a housekeeper's dignity and quietly turned it into cash he did not, in any strict sense, actually need to survive, you have to go back 6 years. to a rainy Tuesday afternoon when a records clerk at the Regional Maritime Archive handed him a box of shipping registry documents he hadn't requested and was never, technically, supposed to see at all. He had gone looking for something entirely ordinary, proof of his late mother's early employment history, needed for a pension inquiry that turned out, in the end, to resolve itself into nothing of any consequence whatsoever. What the box actually contained instead was a set of personal correspondence between a young ship's clockmaker named Edmund Castelain and a woman named Adele Ashcombe, dated across roughly 18 months some 40 years earlier. Ending abruptly the same year, Edmund Castelain married a woman named Rosalind, the woman who would, 3 years after that, give birth to a son named Julian. Desmond had been 11 months old when that correspondence stopped arriving. He never once confronted anyone about what he'd found. He didn't have proof strong enough to force the kind of conversation he might have wanted, and some quiet, stubborn part of him, if he was ever fully honest with himself, didn't actually want proof strong enough for that. He wanted, instead, to keep turning the pages over privately, alone, late at night, in a leather ledger he built entirely by hand, cross-referencing birth records against employment dates, comparing handwriting samples. Studying a single unlabeled photograph of Edmund Castelain standing on a dock beside a boy who was clearly not yet Julian, because Julian, according to every date Desmond could verify, had not yet been born when that photograph was taken. He worked the whole thing the way he worked everything else in his professional life, patiently, invisibly, methodically, across 6 full years, without once telling a single soul at Castelain Maritime that the man he answered to every single day might, if the mathematics held together the way they appeared to, be the half-brother he had somehow been raised his entire life without ever once being told existed. It explained a great deal, once Desmond finally allowed himself to think about it with any real honesty, which he rarely did, even alone. It explained why he had never once, in 17 flawless years of service, been offered even the possibility of a partnership. While men with half his reliability and a fraction of his institutional knowledge moved steadily past him into rooms he was only ever asked to quietly clean up after. It explained a resentment he had spent 2 full decades carefully mistaking for simple, ordinary ambition. He told himself, the night he first opened the Kestrel maintenance supply account and watched the first transfer clear without incident, that he wasn't stealing anything at all. He was collecting, quietly and patiently, on a debt the Castelain family had never once known it owed him, and very likely never would, unless he eventually decided the time had come to make them know it directly. He had not, in all that careful planning, ever once anticipated that a 7-year-old girl on a lobby bench would be the one to finally make the math impossible to keep hidden. Standing alone in his apartment that first night, with an unanswered message glowing face down on the kitchen counter, Desmond understood, for what felt like the very first time in 6 patient years, that his ledger had never actually been about the money at all. It had been, from the very beginning, about being written back into a story that had quietly, deliberately decided he didn't belong in it, before he was even old enough to have a say in the matter. He picked the phone back up a little past 1 in the morning. "Who is this?" he typed. The reply arrived within a minute, careful and unhurried. Someone who thinks the Castelain family has spent far too many years underestimating exactly the wrong people. Meet me at the Solvig boathouse Thursday evening. Bring nothing with you. Just come alone, Adrian Solvig had built Solvig ports and logistics from a single lease dock and 1 second-hand cargo barge into the second-largest freight operation anywhere along the coast, and she had done it. Colleagues liked to say behind her back with a mixture of admiration and genuine wariness, the exact same way she sailed, reading the wind's true direction a full beat before anyone else in the room had even noticed it beginning to shift. She had raced competitive dinghies since she was 9 years old, taught patiently by a father who firmly believed a person's actual character only ever revealed itself in conditions bad enough to make lying about your own fear entirely pointless. She still raced most Sundays even now. In a carefully restored wooden sloop, she maintained herself, refusing every offer of hired crew, and she kept a small trophy cabinet in the corner of her office, not for the trophies themselves, most of them minor. Regional, decades old and slightly tarnished, but for the private, quiet satisfaction of remembering exactly what each one had genuinely cost her to win outright. Publicly, Adrian Solvig was Julian Castellane's single most persistent, most professionally respected competitor. The two companies had spent 9 full years trading contracts back and forth, undercutting each other's freight rates with careful precision, occasionally sitting across the very same negotiating table with the wary, formal courtesy of two ships' captains who both understood, without ever saying so directly, that the harbor simply wasn't large enough for either of them to make a serious public mistake in front of the other. Privately, for the past 11 months, she had been quietly assembling a very different kind of campaign entirely. The city's new harbor bridge, the single largest infrastructure contract awarded in the entire region in over a decade, finally connecting the eastern container terminals directly to the freight rail lines for the first time in the port's history, had been awarded to Castellane Maritime by a narrow council vote that Adrian still believed, correctly, had been decided by exactly 2 votes she should have secured for herself and somehow hadn't. She did not intend to challenge that vote through any courtroom. She intended, instead, to make the man who had won it look catastrophically unfit to be trusted with anything as genuinely large as a bridge. On the one single day the entire city would be watching him prove exactly the opposite in public. The dedication ceremony, already scheduled for the 2nd Saturday of the coming month, where Julian Castellane, true to a personal habit that made him easy to predict and considerably easier still to plan carefully around, would insist on cutting the ceremonial ribbon himself rather than sending any subordinate in his place. She had known about Desmond Ashcombe's steadily mounting personal debts for close to 4 months already, ever since a contact inside a private lending office had mentioned, almost as a passing aside over dinner, that a senior Castellane executive had been quietly borrowing heavily against future bonuses that did not, strictly speaking, yet exist on paper. She had not known, not until a genealogist she'd hired purely out of professional caution turned up the very same shipping registry correspondence Desmond himself had already discovered 6 patient years earlier. Exactly how deep the man's underlying grievance actually ran beneath the surface debt. That single discovery changed her entire plan considerably and almost overnight. A disgruntled employee stealing quietly to cover personal debts was useful, certainly, but replaceable. A disinherited half-brother who had spent 6 patient, careful years documenting his own systematic erasure from a family story was something far more valuable entirely. A man who wouldn't need to be bribed into betraying the Castellane family at all. Only gently, precisely reminded of exactly how long that family had already betrayed him first, without his knowledge or consent. She met Desmond at her boathouse on Thursday evening, exactly as arranged, with 2 cups of black coffee prepared and no assistants present anywhere on the property. "I know what's written in your ledger," she said, before he had even finished crossing fully through the threshold. "I know precisely whose son you actually are. And I know exactly what it cost you today, watching a man half your age walk you out of the only real career you have ever built for yourself." Desmond said nothing at all in response, which she read, correctly, as tacit permission to continue speaking freely. "I don't want your loyalty," she told him plainly. "I want your knowledge." Security rotation schedules. The dedication ceremony's exact route and timing, down to the minute. Which access doors on that property still open on locks nobody has thought to replace in years. She slid the second cup of coffee across the low table toward him, still untouched. In exchange, I make absolutely certain the entire world finally learns exactly whose name should have been written into that family ledger from the very beginning. Publicly. With full documentation behind it. Whatever else happens to the Harbor Bridge contract along the way, Desmond, you get your real name back, permanently, on the record where it always belonged. It was, Desmond would only fully understand much later, an almost perfectly constructed offer, built entirely around the one single thing every careful plan against him had somehow always managed to overlook completely, that he had never actually wanted the money for its own sake at all. He had wanted, for 41 long years, simply to stop being the invisible half of a story everyone else in his family got to finish comfortably without him. He drank the coffee slowly. It had already gone cold sitting there. He drank it anyway, all the way down, and told her everything she had asked him for. Margot returned to work on a bright Tuesday morning in early spring, 3 full weeks after Dr. Ewan had signed the last page of her file with something close to an actual smile. Castellane Maritime had moved her entirely out of housekeeping by then, into a guest relations post on the day shift, full benefits attached. Ines quietly added to the family medical plan on the second page of a contract Margot read through twice before she finally worked up the courage to ask Julian, directly, why any of it had happened at all. You earned every part of it 11 months ago, he told her simply. The paperwork was just slow catching up to what was already true. It was the first time, in all the weeks since that rainy night, that she had seen him come genuinely close to actually smiling. The staff who had once known her only as the quiet woman pushing a cart along the 14th floor now greeted her by name in the hallways without hesitation. The left pocket, not the right one. Though nobody in the building needed reminding of that particular detail anymore. She still painted on her breaks, more out of long habit now than any real necessity, small blue-gray studies sketched onto the backs of guest comment cards instead of receipts, because paper no longer needed to be free in order to be usable. It was one of these small, unremarkable habits that put her, 3 weeks further into that same spring, in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment to notice something nobody else inside the company had thought to look at closely. The Harbor Bridge project, Castellane Maritime's single largest infrastructure contract in over a decade, had begun running into trouble that spring in ways that, taken individually, each looked like nothing more than ordinary, forgettable bad luck. A safety inspection flagged unexplained discrepancies in a shipment of structural cable that had cleanly passed every single prior check along the way. A city council aide leaked, entirely off the record, that 2 separate council members had suddenly begun asking pointed, uncomfortable questions about Castellane's overall compliance history. A supply truck bound for the bridge's eastern anchor point was held for nearly 6 hours at a checkpoint that had genuinely never existed on that particular route before, for reasons no one could later locate documented anywhere in writing. Twice, Teo told Julian carefully, could reasonably be called coincidence. A third instance, surfacing in an entirely different part of the operation, was unmistakably a pattern. Margot's contribution to unraveling all of it came almost entirely by accident. On a slow Thursday afternoon at the guest relations desk, waiting out a quiet lull between check-ins, she had sketched the loading dock visible through the lobby's rear window, the way she sketched most quiet, ordinary views without thinking very much about why she bothered at all. A delivery van sat parked at the dock in her drawing, positioned at an odd, deliberate-looking angle at an hour just past 11 at night, according to the small clock face she'd faithfully drawn into the corner of the page out of pure habit. when no deliveries of any kind were scheduled to arrive. She thought nothing more of it until, 2 full days later, Teo happened to notice the sketch pinned casually to the guest relations breakroom corkboard, where Margot tacked up a new one every week the way some people quietly keep a calendar without ever calling it that. He asked her, carefully and without much explanation of why he was asking, whether she happened to remember the exact date she'd drawn it. She did, without hesitation. She always dated her sketches precisely, the same quiet discipline her own mother had patiently taught her decades earlier. Write the date down clearly. Know exactly when you actually saw what you saw, because memory alone, however vivid it feels in the moment, is never proof of anything to anyone else. The date matched, almost to the exact hour, the same night the structural cable shipment had first been flagged as compromised. Teo traced the delivery van's registration through 3 separate shell addresses before it finally dead-ended at a small logistics subcontractor with no listed employees, no working phone line, and precisely 1 billing contact on file, a numbered account that, after 4 more hours of patient, careful work, resolved cleanly into the very same entity that had quietly funded 2 of the 3 council members now asking such pointed questions about Castellane's compliance record. The subcontractor's registered agent turned out to be a small accounting firm that Adrian Solvig's own company had used consistently for well over a decade. Julian did not act on the discovery immediately, though every instinct in him wanted to. 14 years of running a company that other, less careful competitors had repeatedly tried and failed to undermine had taught him, patiently, that the very first name you uncover is rarely the only name genuinely worth uncovering, and that a rival intelligent enough to hide something this well deserved to be fully understood before she was ever confronted directly. So he did something he had never once done in 9 full years of careful, formal professional rivalry with Adrian Solvig. He asked Teo to look quietly into her family history, not her business dealings, which he already knew intimately down to the smallest detail, but the deeper part of her personal story, the part that usually explains, given enough patience, everything a person never says out loud to anyone at all. What came back to him 2 days later stopped Julian Castellane in a way that the fraud, the sabotage, and the leaked council votes combined never once had managed to. Adrian Solvig's father, a man named Werner Solvig, had worked the overnight shift decades earlier at the very same office tower where Julian's own mother had collapsed 30 years before. He had been one of exactly 2 men on duty that particular night. And according to the tower's own disciplinary file, quietly archived and all but entirely forgotten by everyone still living, Werner Solvig had, in fact, been the one who first noticed something was seriously wrong, who had reported it, clearly and specifically, not once but twice, to a night supervisor who had dismissed both reports outright as nothing worth interrupting his own scheduled break for. By the time anyone finally acted on the 3rd alarm, close to 38 full minutes had already passed. Julian's mother survived that night by a margin of roughly the width of the 2 minutes remaining after that. The tower's owners, facing a scandal they very much wanted contained quickly and quietly, had needed someone to blame publicly, cheaply, and fast. The night supervisor who had genuinely ignored both reports kept his position without incident. Werner Solvig, the one man who had actually tried, twice, to raise the alarm in time, was fired within the week that followed, his personnel file quietly altered afterward to suggest a negligence that the surviving disciplinary correspondence, buried for 3 full decades, now made unmistakably clear had never once been his to carry. He never worked in harbor administration again, in any capacity, for the rest of his working life. His family spent the following decade slowly rebuilding almost everything from nothing at all, on the strength of a single lease dock and a 9-year-old daughter who had watched her own father lose absolutely everything for doing the one single thing he had actually provably done right, and who had promised herself, somewhere in the long grinding years of that rebuilding, that she would never again allow a family with a name as large as Castellane to quietly decide who deserved to be believed and who deserved instead to be blamed. Julian sat alone with the file for a long time before he fully understood the complete, deeply uncomfortable shape of what he was actually holding in his hands. His entire adult rule, never once walk past a child left to carry something heavy entirely alone, had been built directly from a single night when one man had genuinely tried to stop, twice, and had been quietly overruled both times. And the world had gone on to punish the man who had tried instead of the one who never bothered to. Adrian Solveig had spent 30 patient years turning that exact same injustice into a very different kind of personal rule of her own. Trust no name larger than your own, and take by force whatever a name that large would never once willingly choose to share. 2 children, born from opposite sides of the very same terrible night, had grown into 2 entirely different answers to the exact same unanswered question, and only one of those 2 answers, Julian now understood with real discomfort, had somewhere along the way stopped mattering more than the actual people it claimed to be protecting. It did not excuse, in any way, what she was actively doing now: the sabotage, the leaked votes, a stolen man's entire dignity quietly turned into a weapon against people who had genuinely never harmed her personally in any way. But it explained, with a clarity that unsettled him considerably more than any ledger or hidden shell account ever could have on its own, exactly why she believed, with total and unshakable conviction, that she was the one who was truly owed something here. He would need to decide, and soon, whether that new understanding actually changed what he was about to do next, or whether it simply made the doing of it that much harder to carry out without flinching, even once. The invitation reached Margot through the hotel's own events office, entirely plausible on its surface in every visible detail: a small recognition ceremony scheduled ahead of the Harbor Bridge dedication itself, honoring a handful of Castellane employees who had shown particular resilience over the past difficult year, her own name and Inessa's included by name on the printed program. "Bring your daughter," the note read warmly. "It will mean a great deal to Mr. Castellane personally, and we know how proud she'll be." Julian had never approved any such ceremony, and had no idea it existed at all until Theo, running one final security sweep of the dedication site 2 full days out of nothing more than long habit, found Margot and Inessa's names quietly appended to the official guest list through a vendor account Theo recognized instantly, a fresh alias this time, but carrying the exact same careful fingerprints as Kestrel Maintenance Supply had months earlier. What Theo found next, walking the length of the half-finished pedestrian walkway alongside the bridge's eastern anchor point, stopped him completely cold. One section of the walkway's temporary safety railing, positioned directly beneath the exact spot where the dedication program had specifically choreographed the ceremonial first crossing to take place, had been quietly, deliberately disconnected from its load-bearing bracket, then reset just loosely enough to appear entirely intact under any ordinary standing inspection. It would hold ordinary foot traffic without incident. It would not hold the combined weight of a group pausing there together for the exact photograph the program had specifically planned around. Theo called Julian directly from the site, his voice flatter and more careful than Julian had ever once heard it in 11 years of working alongside him. "They're not trying to embarrass you at this ceremony, sir," he said. "They're making absolutely certain it's the very last one you're ever able to host." Margot and Ines were already 20 minutes from the venue, riding in a car the events office had personally arranged for them, when Julian's call finally reached them both. He didn't try to explain everything at once. He didn't need to. "Please don't go to the bridge," he said, his own voice tighter than he intended it to sound. "I'll explain absolutely everything, all of it, the moment you're both somewhere safe. I promise you that." He reached the site himself 12 long minutes later, coat still open, moving through the crowd the exact same way he had once moved through the lobby the night this entire story first began, unhurried on the visible surface of things, entirely otherwise underneath it. Teo had already quietly cleared the walkway of its small setup crew and rerouted the ceremony itself to solid ground on the western approach, citing a routine structural inspection that happened, for once, to be completely and genuinely true. It was Desmond, arriving at the site alone and entirely unannounced 20 minutes after that, who finally confirmed exactly how close it had actually come to disaster. He found Julian standing at the exact edge of the disconnected railing section, looking down in silence at the dark water some 40 feet below the walkway. "I set the bracket myself," Desmond said. There was no version of that particular sentence that could have been made easier to say aloud, and he didn't attempt to make it easier on himself. 3 nights ago. I was told it only needed to hold long enough to produce one bad photograph, a fall that would look, to anyone watching, like straightforward negligence, nothing more than that, just enough to quietly end the contract and end you publicly along with it. He stopped walking entirely. I genuinely did not know, until roughly an hour ago, that they had moved the ceremony's timing up without telling me, or that a child would be standing directly on it when it finally happened. Julian said nothing at all for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this now, Desmond?" "Because I spent 6 long years quietly building a ledger about a family that had never once truly seen me," Desmond said, his voice cracking slightly on the words, "and somewhere across the last 3 weeks, I became exactly the kind of person willing to let 2 people who had never once done anything to harm me simply disappear into a harbor, just to finally make somebody look at me directly." His voice broke fully on the last few words, the first genuinely unguarded sound Julian had heard from him across 17 years of working together. "I don't need you to forgive any of it. I need you to stop it before Saturday. That's all I'm asking for." Chapter 11. What was owed? Julian did not call the authorities first. He called Adrienne Solvig directly, at her boathouse, and told her exactly one thing without preamble, that he already knew about the railing, that it had been safely disarmed before it could hurt anyone at all, and that he was giving her precisely one chance to meet him in person before he decided, finally, what happened next between them. She came alone the following evening to the very same boathouse where she had first offered Desmond his real name back. She did not deny a single part of it when he arrived. That, more than the sabotage itself, was what stayed with Julian longest afterward, that when the actual choice finally arrived in front of her, Adrienne Solvig chose the truth the exact same way she chose everything else in her life, without once flinching away from it. "Your father's ferry terminal," she said, before he had even fully finished sitting down across from her. "My father tried, twice, to save your mother's life that night, and your family's company fired him inside a single week for having tried, because someone needed to be blamed publicly, and it was never, under any circumstances, going to be the man carrying the correct last name." Her jaw tightened visibly. "I have spent 30 entire years watching families exactly like yours quietly decide who gets believed and who doesn't. I was not going to let it happen a third time, not while I had any power at all to stop it." "A third time," Julian repeated quietly, letting the words settle. "My father. Then Desmond. And whoever would have come next, the moment it was convenient for someone with more power than either of them." She looked at him for a long, unbroken moment, something in her usual composure finally, visibly cracking open. "I told myself, for a very long time, that made what I was doing something like justice. I have known, honestly, for at least the last 3 days, that it stopped being justice the exact moment it came to involve an actual child standing on that bridge. I let it happen anyway, because by then I had already decided I couldn't afford to be the one who stopped. Julian set 2 documents down on the low table between them, not a hurried settlement drafted overnight by a team of lawyers, but something he had spent the previous entire evening building himself, alone, in the same quiet, careful hand he normally used to reset a chronometer's delicate balance wheel. The first was a formal, fully public correction to his own company's 30-year-old disciplinary record, an explicit acknowledgement, verified directly against the archived correspondence Teo had recovered, that Werner Solveig had done precisely what his daughter had always privately known he had done, and had been punished for it entirely unjustly. The second was an offer, not silence, and not a quiet payoff meant to make the whole matter simply disappear, but an actual seat, if she genuinely wanted it, on a brand new joint harbor safety oversight board the 2 companies would build together going forward, answerable to neither one of them alone. You could have destroyed me completely at that ceremony, he said. Legally, publicly, permanently, and you would very likely have been believed, because for once you would actually have been right about the exact thing you were angriest about. I am not offering you this instead of consequences, Adrian. The sabotage still goes to the proper authorities, in full, and you already know that. I am offering you the one thing nobody ever offered your father when it would have actually mattered most, a real name on the record, instead of a story someone else got to quietly finish writing about you. Adrian did not answer for a long time. When she finally did, her voice had lost the careful, practiced edge it had carried through the entire rest of the conversation. 30 years, she said softly. And not one single person from your family ever once thought to simply ask what had actually happened to mine. I'm asking now, Julian said. It doesn't undo 30 years, Adrian. I understand that completely. But it isn't nothing either. She signed the correction that same night, without hesitation. The criminal matter, exactly as Julian had promised her it would, went to the proper authorities in full, the sabotage, the leaked council votes, the falsified inspection reports, every last piece of it. But the public record now carried, permanently and for the first time in 3 full decades, the true and complete account of a night her father had tried, twice, to do the one single thing that had actually mattered. Desmond's case resolved somewhat differently and considerably more slowly. Full restitution, a formal guilty plea to every fraud charge brought against him, and at Julian's personal insistence, over the quiet objections of nearly everyone else in the company's senior leadership, a public acknowledgement, fully verified by the same archived correspondence, that Desmond Ashcombe was, in fact, Edmund Castellane's eldest son. Not a partnership. Not any title of significance. But a name, entered correctly into a family record for the very first time in 52 years, and eventually, once his sentence was fully served, a genuine role helping build the very worker protection safeguards his own fraud had first exposed the desperate need for in the first place. I'm not forgiving what you did, Julian told him, the last time the 2 men spoke before Desmond's formal hearing. But I understand now, finally, exactly what it cost you to spend an entire life invisible inside a story that should have had room for you from the very start. That's worth fixing, whether or not you'd fully earned the fixing back yet. Some debts run in directions nobody ever remembers to check. The Harbor Bridge dedication went ahead exactly 2 weeks later than originally scheduled, on a bright, wind-scrubbed Saturday morning that felt, to almost everyone standing on the western approach, entirely unconnected to the storm that had nearly broken over it. Julian cut the ribbon himself, exactly as he always insisted on doing, though this time Teo stood close enough at his shoulder to be seen clearly in every photograph, and neither man pretended that was an accident. The city's morning paper carried two stories side by side the following week, and it was the pairing itself, more than either story alone, that people in the Harbor District kept talking about for months afterward. The first was straightforward infrastructure coverage: the bridge, the ribbon, the Eastern Rail connection finally complete after a decade of council delays. The second, printed directly beneath it at Julian's own explicit request, was a formal correction to a 30-year-old disciplinary record, a detailed, fully documented account of a night watchman named Werner Solvig who had tried, twice, to raise an alarm that could have prevented a tragedy and had been quietly punished for the trying instead of thanked for it. Adrienne Solvig did not attend the ceremony. She sent, instead, a short private note to Julian's office the same morning, which he read once, standing at his study window, and did not show to anyone else. My father used to say the water never actually forgets anything, it only waits. I didn't understand what he meant by that until this week. Thank you for finally listening to what it had been carrying all along. The criminal proceedings against both Desmond and Adrienne moved through the courts with considerably less public drama than the city's rumor mill had initially predicted. Adrienne's legal team negotiated a settlement built around full restitution, a permanent seat surrendered on Solvigport's own board, and 2 years of community-supervised probation rather than any prison sentence. A resolution the prosecutor's office, weighing the corrected disciplinary record now sitting alongside the sabotage charge, ultimately agreed was closer to actual justice than a harsher penalty would have been. Desmond's sentence ran longer, 18 months, reduced from the original recommendation once his full cooperation and the railing warning were formally entered into the record, and he began serving it quietly, without complaint, the same steady, unremarkable diligence he had once brought to 17 years of covering up something else entirely. Inside Castellane Maritime itself, the changes moved faster and went considerably deeper than either court case. Every department across all 11 hotels received an anonymous reporting line, independently audited outside the company's own management structure, answerable directly to a new oversight board that included, within its first month, both Teo Bramonti and, at her own quiet request, submitted the same week she signed the correction, Adrienne Solvig. Margot was asked, gently, whether she wanted any part of her own story used publicly to help explain why the reporting line existed at all. She thought about it for 3 full days before she answered. Not my name, she told Julian finally, over coffee in the guest relations break room where her sketches still went up every week. But if it helps someone else recognize what they're looking at before it takes 6 weeks and a hospital visit to notice, then yes. Use whatever helps. What went up on the company's internal training materials, in the end, was not her name at all, but a single line drawn directly from something Ines had said to a company psychologist during a brief, voluntary counseling session arranged in the weeks after the bridge, a line the 7-year-old had delivered so simply and so exactly that nobody on the training committee felt the need to improve on it. If someone's too tired to ask for help twice, that doesn't mean they stopped needing it. It just means somebody has to notice the first time. Teo, for his part, found the aftermath settling into him more slowly and more strangely than he'd expected. He had spent 11 years learning to read a room for threats before anyone in it had finished their first sentence, and he had assumed, once the sabotage was uncovered and the danger passed, that the particular tightness he'd carried in his chest since the night on the walkway would simply loosen and disappear on its own. It didn't, not entirely. What loosened instead, gradually, over the weeks that followed, was something else, a habit, decades old, of keeping every person he worked to protect at exactly the same careful, professional distance, regardless of how long he'd known them or how much he'd come to care. Ines broke that habit first, and without any apparent effort at all. She began seeking him out specifically on the mornings he worked the harbor bridge site, carrying small wooden animals he'd carved for her the way she once carried her tin of watercolor pencils, and asking him, with the same patient seriousness she brought to everything, to teach her how the fox shape worked, which cuts came first, which ones you saved for last, why you always sanded with the grain and never against it. My grandmother used to say the wood already knows what it wants to be, Teo told her one Sunday at the shelter, guiding her hand carefully along a half-finished shape with his own scarred fingers. You're not making the fox. You're just taking away everything that isn't the fox yet. She turned that thought over for a long moment, the way she turned over most things worth keeping. Is that like what Mr. Castellane does with his clocks? Close enough, Teo admitted. Different tools. Same patience. By early summer, the shelter where he'd spent 6 quiet years carving animals alone on Sunday mornings had gained a second regular volunteer, small enough to need a stool to reach the workbench, serious enough that none of the older children ever once teased her for asking so many careful questions. The company's changes, meanwhile, kept widening in ways Julian himself hadn't fully anticipated when he'd first ordered the anonymous reporting line built. 3 more discrepancies surfaced within the first 2 months of its existence, none of them approaching the scale of what Desmond had built, all of them real, all of them quietly corrected before they could compound into anything worse. A payroll clerk 2 properties over, it turned out, had been pocketing small amounts from tip pools for the better part of a year, banking on the same assumption Desmond once had, that nobody senior enough would ever think to look closely at people who worked in the building's least visible corners. Julian read every report personally for the first 6 months, refusing his own board's suggestion that the volume didn't merit his direct attention any longer. It merited attention when it was 1 housekeeper and 1 bench, he told them, in a tone that ended the conversation without needing to raise itself at all. It merits exactly the same attention now that it's 40. The city council, for its part, quietly opened its own review into how 2 of its members had come to accept funding tied to a numbered holding company, a process that would take considerably longer than the harbor bridge itself had taken to build, and would end, eventually, in 1 resignation and 1 formal censure, neither headline as dramatic as the sabotage plot that had prompted the review, both of them, in their own smaller way, part of the same long arithmetic finally being corrected. The months that followed moved, for the first time in longer than either Margot or Julian could easily remember, at an almost boringly ordinary pace, and both of them came to treasure the boredom of it more than either would have predicted beforehand. Julian began coming home earlier most evenings, a change he told himself, unconvincingly, was purely about the residual security situation. In truth, it had far more to do with a standing arrangement that had formed itself gradually, without either adult ever formally proposing it. Dinner most Thursdays at Margot and Inessa's small apartment above the bakery when the weather cooperated, or at Julian's own quiet residence when Iness specifically requested to see the workshop again, which she did, with increasing frequency, roughly every other week. The workshop fascinated her in a way nothing else about Julian's world seemed to. She was permitted, under careful supervision, to hold the smallest of the disassembled chronometer components, a balance wheel no larger than a coin, a mainspring coiled tighter than anything she'd ever seen, and Julian found himself explaining, patiently, the same lesson his own father had once given him at almost exactly her age, that a chronometer that lost even 4 seconds a day could put an entire ship on the wrong side of an ocean, and that the only real difference between a broken clock and a working one was whether somebody had bothered to notice the drift before it became a disaster. "Is that why you always check yours on Sundays?" Iness asked him one evening, watching him reset the balance wheel of a particularly old piece with the small, precise tools laid out in careful rows across the velvet tray. "That's exactly why," he said. "Small things drift first. If you catch the drift early enough, it's just maintenance. If you wait, it's a wreck." She considered that for a long moment with the same careful seriousness she brought to most things worth considering. "Is that why you stopped for me?" "Because you caught the drift early." Julian set down his tools entirely and looked at her directly, the way he had learned, over these past months, that she preferred to be looked at when a question actually mattered to her. "No," he said. "I stopped for you because nobody caught the drift early enough for my own mother once, and I promised myself I'd never let that happen again in front of me if I could help it. You weren't a maintenance problem, Ines. You were the one person in that whole lobby who was telling the truth loudly enough that somebody finally had to listen." Margot, for her part, had slowly reclaimed the kitchen at Julian's residence, asking permission the first time, almost apologetically, and never needing to ask again after that. She cooked simply, the recipes her own mother had taught her before the fire that took almost everything else, and more than once Julian found himself standing in the doorway of his own kitchen, coat still on, listening to the particular, unfamiliar sound of ordinary laughter filling a house that had spent most of its existence being merely efficient. One evening on the back terrace, watching Ines chase fireflies across the dark lawn below with the specific, joyful abandon of a child who had finally stopped rationing her own energy for later, Margot set down her tea and spoke without quite looking at him. "She used to save half of everything she ate," she said. "Did you know that? Half a sandwich, folded carefully back into its wrapper, in case later came and there wasn't anything else." She wrapped both hands around the cooling cup. "Last week I watched her finish an entire plate and ask for more, like food was just a thing that comes back again tomorrow without her having to plan for it. Like tomorrow was something she could actually trust now." "My mother used to say things would get better," Julian said quietly after a moment. "She said it at our own kitchen table, on the nights her pay came in short. I used to think she said it because she believed it completely. I understand now she probably said it because saying it out loud was the only thing keeping her moving toward the next shift." He looked out at the dark line of the harbor beyond the lawn. "Nobody stopped for her in time. I know exactly what that costs every single day, whether or not anyone else in the room ever notices the cost being paid." Margot turned to look at him fully then, at the man the whole city still, out of old habit, lowered its voice around, and saw instead, with sudden and complete clarity, a boy on a plastic chair in a hospital corridor who had never once stopped counting the minutes since. She didn't say anything in response. She simply moved her hand 3 careful inches along the railing between them until it rested lightly beside his, not quite touching, not needing to yet. They stood there together for a long time in the settling dark, 2 people who had each, in their own very different ways, spent a lifetime learning exactly what it cost when nobody stopped, and who had finally, slowly, without either of them planning it out loud, found somewhere worth standing still in. Ines, unaware of most of what passed quietly between the 2 adults on the terrace behind her, had her own private ritual that summer, one she never fully explained to either Margot or Julian, though both of them noticed it eventually in their own separate ways. Every Sunday evening, after Teo had walked her home from the shelter and before dinner was called, she took her tin of watercolor pencils out onto the small balcony of the apartment above the bakery and painted exactly one thing: the view of the harbor. From memory, the same way her mother had once painted it on the backs of guest comment cards during quiet shifts. She never painted the bridge, or the hotel, or anything that had happened that spring. She painted, week after week, the same small stretch of water beneath the same stretch of sky, slightly different each time depending on the light, and stacked the finished pages carefully in a growing pile inside a shoebox beneath her bed. The way her mother stacked hers in a tin, the way Margot realized one evening while tucking her in, some things simply pass from one generation to the next without ever needing to be formally taught. "Why the harbor?" Margot asked her one night, sitting on the edge of the bed with one of the recent pages in her hand, admiring how much steadier Inés's line work had become since spring. Inés considered the question with her usual seriousness before answering. "Because it's the thing that was there the whole time," she said. "Before anybody noticed anything. It didn't have to change to make everything else change. It was just waiting there, being true, until somebody finally looked at it properly." Margot did not have an answer for that. She simply kissed her daughter's forehead and left the page pinned, gently, to the corkboard above the desk, beside a growing collection of others exactly like it. Julian, for his part, found himself changing in smaller, quieter ways that took him considerably longer to notice in himself than they took Théo or Margot to notice in him. He stopped, for the first time in nearly 30 years, resetting every chronometer in his workshop alone on Sunday mornings. Inés joined him most weeks now, perched on the tall stool beside his workbench, handling the smallest components under careful supervision, and somewhere across that first full summer, the ritual quietly became a shared one rather than a private one, without either of them ever formally deciding to change it. He also began, for the first time since his mother's collapse 3 decades earlier, visiting the old ferry terminal itself, not the current administrative offices, which had long since moved to a modern glass building nearer the container yards, but the original overnight security post itself, decommissioned for years, kept as a small unstaffed historical marker at the Harbor Authority's own insistence. He went alone, the first few times, standing quietly in the exact spot where a young security supervisor had once dismissed 2 honest reports rather than interrupt his own break. On his 4th visit, he brought Inés with him and explained, in simple terms she could hold on to, exactly what had happened there and why the rule that had shaped his entire adult life had needed a place like this one to be born in. "Is it a sad place?" she asked, looking around the small, dusty room with the particular unflinching curiosity she brought to most things adults tried gently to shield her from. "It used to be, for me," Julian said. "I'm not sure it has to stay that way, though. I think it can just be a place that taught me something important, even if the way it taught me was terrible." He crouched down slightly, an old habit by now. Whenever he wanted to make sure she understood, he was speaking to her directly and not simply past her. That's usually how the most important rules get built, in my experience. Not from books. From the exact moment somebody realizes what happens when nobody stops in time. Inés nodded slowly, filing that away the way she filed away most things worth keeping, and reached for his hand without being asked, the 2 of them standing together in the quiet, dusty room for a long moment before either one spoke again. The Aurelia Grand's lobby looked, on the last Sunday morning of that spring, exactly the way it had looked on the rainy night this entire story first began, marble polished within the hour, chandeliers throwing their same soft gold light. A wooden bench beneath the tall eastern window that had, for one particular family, quietly become the single most important piece of furniture in the entire building. Margot believed they were there for brunch. Inés had sworn herself to secrecy 3 full days earlier and had kept the secret with the fierce, glowing discipline of a 7-year-old entrusted with something genuinely enormous, though Théo later admitted, with visible amusement, that she had personally checked the lobby's flower arrangements no fewer than twice on her own initiative, entirely unprompted, just to be certain everything looked exactly right. Julian led them both to the bench itself, where a small brass plaque had been fitted into the marble at its base that same morning. He crouched down to read it aloud together with Inés before any of the gathered staff could see it first, the same way he had once crouched down to hear her, at her own eye level, on a night none of them would ever fully stop quietly thinking about. Asterisk for the ones who wait. Someone is always meant to stop. Asterisk. Beneath the plaque, in smaller lettering, was the name of a new company-wide initiative Julian had spent the past 6 weeks building carefully alongside his senior staff, a fully independent worker protection fund, externally audited, with an anonymous reporting line answerable directly to a board that now included, permanently, both Teo Bramonti and Adrian Solvig, who had asked, entirely unprompted, to help design its structure from the ground up. The small crowd gathered near the eastern wall for the unveiling was not, in the end, entirely made up of senior staff and department heads. Dr. Amara Ewan stood near the back, having closed her unmarked clinic for the morning at Julian's personal invitation. A records clerk from the Regional Maritime Archive, the same woman who had unknowingly handed Desmond a box of documents 6 years earlier, had been quietly located and invited as well, though she had no idea, even now, what role that particular afternoon had played in everything that followed. Camille, a housekeeping colleague of Margot's who had covered her shifts more than once during the worst of the 6 weeks without ever being asked to, stood near the front with her own small daughter on her hip, watching the whole thing with an expression somewhere between pride and quiet relief. Even Adrian Solvig had come, in the end, standing slightly apart from the main gathering near the revolving door, as though she hadn't fully decided, right up until the last moment, whether she belonged in this particular room at all. Julian had noticed her arrival and crossed the lobby briefly before the ceremony began, and the two of them had exchanged only a handful of quiet words, enough, apparently, because when he returned to the bench she was still there, standing a little closer to the gathered staff than she had been a few minutes earlier. Margot read the plaque through twice, then looked up at him directly, and made no attempt at all to hide what was plainly written across her own face. They called it the 40 Minutes Fund, because Julian had finally, that same week, told Margot the complete story of exactly where his one unbending rule had actually come from: a boy on a hospital corridor chair, a slow-moving wall clock, and a stretch of time nobody should ever have to survive entirely alone, with nobody stopping to ask if they needed help. Margot read the plaque through twice, then looked up at him directly, and made no attempt at all to hide what was plainly written across her own face. "You didn't have to build all of this because of us," she said quietly. "I didn't build it because of you," Julian said. "I built it because of everyone this hotel had already quietly trained itself not to see, long before you ever once sat on that bench waiting for a shift to finally end. You and Ines simply made it impossible for me to keep pretending I hadn't already noticed." Ines, who had been listening throughout with the particular gravity she reserved only for conversations she personally considered genuinely important, reached into the same worn tin box she still carried with her everywhere and produced a single folded piece of paper. On it, in careful, oversized pencil letters, she had drawn 3 figures standing together beside a bench beneath a skylight: a woman with dark hair, a small girl holding a paint tin against her chest, and a tall man in a long coat, kneeling down to meet them both at eye level. Above the 3 figures, in the unrationed handwriting of a child who had not yet learned to save her very best words for later, she had written 6 of them, pressed hard enough into the paper that the pencil had nearly torn through it in one place. "The man who finally stopped walking." Julian looked at that drawing for a long, long moment, the lobby's soft gold light catching the worn edges of the paper the same way it had once caught the rain on his own coat, on the night this entire story had first quietly begun. Then he folded it closed with real care and slid it into the inner pocket of his own coat, the one directly over his heart, the one that had stayed carefully, deliberately empty for nearly 30 years. "Thank you, Ines," he said. I'll keep this with me for as long as I'm still able to. Outside the tall eastern window, the harbor caught the late morning light exactly the way it always had, indifferent, as harbors generally are, to whatever quiet arithmetic had finally been settled inside the building beside it. But inside, on a bench that had once held one waiting, uncounted child in the dark, 3 people stood together now in the daylight, in absolutely no hurry at all to be anywhere else. This was never really a story about stolen wages, or a bridge, or a ledger a lonely man kept hidden for 6 secret years. It was about the particular, quiet arithmetic every family, every company, and every city performs constantly without ever once saying it out loud, deciding, moment by moment, whose 40 minutes are genuinely worth stopping for, and whose are simply allowed to pass by entirely unnoticed. Desmond Ashcombe was never a villain in any simple sense of the word. He was something considerably more uncomfortable to sit with honestly, a man who spent 52 years believing, correctly, that he had been quietly erased from a story that should have had room for him from the very beginning, and who chose, in the end, the one response that made him exactly as blind to someone else's 40 minutes as the world had once, cruelly, been to his own. Adrian Solvig carried a grievance that was entirely, painfully true from the very start, and still very nearly let it cost an innocent child her life, because righteous anger, left unchecked for long enough, eventually stops asking who actually stands in its path. The governing question this story keeps quietly circling back to as one honest answer, and it isn't a comfortable one to sit with. We owe the people we have trained ourselves not to see the exact same 40 minutes we would want someone, anyone, to give us on the one night it finally turns out to matter more than anything else we happen to be doing instead. Real power, this story suggests, was never actually about who could seize the most. It was always, in the end, simply about who chose to stop.